So we've got to make some noise so that people come after lunch, huh?
Maybe I should give away some free gift cards. Maybe that help out.
So let's just get in it, AJ. So you and I had a conversation a couple of months ago, and you were reflecting on your transition from Vanda into Starbucks. You had a talk with Howard, and he asked you, "Do you have any questions?"
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us the question that you asked him, and sort of, I think it's good context setting for this group.
Yeah, I think, one of the most fortunate things you have is if you're sitting with somebody like Howard, there's so many different questions that could come to one's mind. The first question that came to my mind was, so how did you convince people to stand in line for coffee? Because that's a rare thing to think about, right? Because you have to imagine it's the 1970s, 1980s. People are used to abusing coffee, right? And putting it in a percolator and all that kind of stuff. And you actually convince people to step outside of their homes, to line up and to say, I want to be a part of this delightful experience and be a part of this third place. How do you bring that in some sense of vision, particularly when people can't see it? When everything's about being at home, being convenient, and being a run out. And actually, people were comfortable with bad coffee. So that was another thing too, right?
Hot coffee.
And yeah, exactly. So I think that was that, and it was just a great way to just hear, quite frankly, one of the best merchants of our time kind of speak about that and articulate that. And it was really about how do you sell not so much the product, but how do you sell everything around it, the accoutrement, the culture, and all these other elements that come to it. And that was it was an amazing conversation that we were able to have.
And I think that's a good segue into the next discussion I want to talk about. So much of what is sort of a central theme to the Global Summit this year is about how companies are living their values, consistently and globally.
Yeah.
And I think there's no better organization that's guided and led by values than Starbucks. So I guess from my perspective, what's it like working for an organization for whom values is so important?
Yeah.
And give us a sense of when you've had to make a tough decision where the North Star were the company values.
Yeah, I think so. The company itself situates itself around values. The three things we have to always think about. So there's the values of our partners, the people who work in our stores each and every day, who work in our plants, who make the business run. We have almost 500,000 of those globally. We're in 84 countries. We almost have 40,000 stores. And we're the 5th most recognized brand in the world. And so in that, the value proposition is one about who sits and who articulates what that value is. So the first screen we have to go through is what is the screen and the view through our partner's lens in terms of what their experiences are. The second is the context of the culture that we're sitting in. And how do we view, if you will, where that value proposition lays within that culture. And then the third is this double click down, which is how do we lift both of those to a sense of a coherent understanding of enterprise value. And ultimately, when you think about Starbucks, what really gets people to be connected is their affinity or orientation to the values that we hold. And I think early on, the company realized that we can use the power of brand to both highlight value and also accentuate value. When we make difficult decisions, so I'll give you a good example, not difficult in terms of the choice, but difficult in terms of how it plays itself out. So say, for instance, most recently, and given that we're close to elections, you can all appreciate this. In Georgia, there was a real issue about access to the ballot box for disenfranchised populations. Our partners very attunely said, Starbucks, this is a place where you need to step in and play, and we did. Immediately, we had requests from countries in Africa, Middle East, Asia, South America, where all we have either farms, where we have stores, where we have plants, or what have you, who are all having their contested issues of elections that were going on and access to the ballot box and asking us to be involved in those issues. And you have to weigh those in all the unique contexts. So when you, as I say, when you kind of make a push in one space, you have to recognize how it filters out to all these different areas that you situate yourselves in. And I didn't appreciate how the power of brand can also lift up visibility of people's strife and struggles. And I think Starbucks has a way of doing that. I mean, we just recently, joined in on the issue around DACA and the concerns that we're having with the Supreme Court about that. I mean, most people wouldn't expect a coffee company to be involved in that, but yet we're at the forefront of that conversation and will continue to be. And that brings us into other conversations around immigration, around migration, around migrant movements globally too as well. As you all probably know, I'm a bit of a demographic nerd. And so right now we have the most number of people who are on the move in this world today than we ever had in our history of our society. And so what does that now mean in terms of the role that Starbucks has to play within that conversation?
You'll always get lots of important random facts from AJ in a conversation. And just for everyone's benefit, when AJ talks about a partner, that is, and keep me honest here, any employee
Yes.
in Starbucks, in particular the barista and others in store.
Correct. Yes, we are all, the most important title we have is partner. In fact, inside the building, you will never find an executive or anybody introduce themselves, I'm executive so-and-so or EVP so-and-so. We all call ourselves partner. In fact, the most rewarding thing you can say to somebody in the company is to say that I'm proud to be your partner. And there's just a connectivity, if you will, in reference to all of it.
I remember going to campus in Seattle for the first time, and people would introduce themselves by their tenure. I'm a 20-year partner.
Yes.
I'm a 2-year partner. So I think it also just speaks to living the values and the brands to create that culture.
Absolutely.
So no surprise,
Yeah.
By either one of us. I mean, Starbucks has been in the news
Yeah.
a lot lately. You're
Yeah.
always in the news.
Yeah. Sell a lot of coffee.
And not necessarily for the ice toasted vanilla
That is
oat
true.
milk latte or espresso.
That's true.
But given some challenges you
Yes.
guys are managing through with labor.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about how you're sort of navigating that sort of complicated situation while you're still trying to maintain truth to the value proposition.
Absolutely. So as many of you may know, and Chris knows this, I'll start a little bit of a personal narrative here. Today is my 1-year anniversary at Starbucks. And so could be no better place than being here with you, Chris, and being at this conference, more importantly. When I was going through my interview process, I like to tell people, labor was not on the application. There was no elements around that. It was about all these other things that you can appreciate a CCO job would be. The ironic element, though, is I have this distinct element of a labor background. So for those of you all, just for the sake of sharing here, so my father was a 32-year police officer in a labor union in Houston, Texas. I also, when in Iowa, I went to school in Iowa, but in my time when I was there, was trained as what is called a SALT, or an organizer, if you will, in the meatpacking industry. And then later on, actually wind up spending time both on doing what I call political fundraising for unions, both in terms of helping with their independent expenditures, in terms of political orientation, and then also wound up doing a lot of counseling around unions for corporations, whether they were doing collective bargaining elements or they were going through unionization elements. And then on top of that, I funded unions when I was at the Kellogg Foundation, if you will, in reference to unionization, both in terms of the strawberry packers, if you will, strawberry pickers in California, and then also looking at domestic workers. So I had that with me, didn't know that was going to be of any use or value, and then came into this. And so in this conversation, 3 things have been interesting. So one is, as we talk about value, it's really important to find out who is the owner of what value and how is that being imprinted. And I think during the pandemic, a unique dynamic happened where we found out that the values that we hold are inexplicably linked to who has a chance to imprint those values. We saw that in 2020, that our values were called into question over 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And how that all plays itself out really shifted the way in which people thought about the imprinting of values. So that's one. The second piece inside Starbucks is the way in which the values are connected to the work itself. Inside our stores, you have to appreciate, for those of you all, particularly now that 72% of all of the products that we sell are cold, you have to appreciate the nature of the work inside the stores has dramatically changed. And the extent to which one gives both voice and connectivity to that is part and parcel. And that is where, in many respects, the conversation around both unions, but more importantly about labor and the voice of labor, is where the country is today. And I think any company has to own that, has to appreciate that, has to accept that. The unique challenge that we have is because we are a 51-year company who has built ourselves on values, you have to also be mindful that the way in which we see our values moving against, if you will, the way in which we are going to deliver outcomes is something that we hold dearly to ourselves. So I put this in this way. If any of you all were having a dinner at your house and some person just showed up and came into your house and said, well, I don't think the way you do your food is right. Even if you're the most welcoming and most honest and most opening person, you're going to take a little bit of issue with that. Let me just be clear. The question that you're trying to unpack is, with your values, is what's underneath it. And what I have learned and what we are learning is how do we get underneath it? How do we get underneath the call, if you will, that's being presented to us?
And I think that's been the most eye-opening part of our journey.
Yes.
As you're looking at trying to sort of manage through this, is that there seems like there's a high receptivity
Yes.
to learning.
Yes.
And
Yes.
to open discussions
Yes.
to try to evolve the
Yes.
organization and meet your partners, sort of where they are, maybe not necessarily where you want them to be.
Yeah. And being comfortable hearing things you don't want to hear.
Right.
Which I think for a lot of companies, they wouldn't do that. I mean, when Howard came back, 2 days in him coming back, myself and a bunch of others, we actually went over to 151 stores and spent time with partners. We went to all of our plants and we heard all kinds of things that people were doing.
Yeah.
And most people would not want to hear that.
Yeah. So last bit, and then I'm going to pivot. So
Sure.
ironically, this is your 1 year anniversary. I know that well because you and I
Yes.
spoke about it, but you've had now 3 bosses
Yes.
over the last year
Yeah.
alone. So lots of transition. What should we expect
Yeah.
from this new CEO and the next generation of what you all are building at Starbucks?
Yeah, it's funny. Starbucks, we have the great fortune when the opportunity comes to be a CEO of our company, there's no shortage of people who want to take on the role. And I think the beauty that we have, I kind of want to walk through the 3 really quickly. So when I was hired, Kevin Johnson actually was our CEO at the time, former Microsoft, former tech person, had a very much tech and science and software background. His father was a theoretical physicist. And so you have to appreciate systems were really important to him. And so he brought a sense of systemization to the company in reference to it, coming off of the founder. And then as Howard comes back, he's coming back not only at a time when no systems have now been created, but also when the company is almost twice the size it was since he had left. And we have this global orientation now that is as a new flywheel that's growing. We have beached, if you will, our growth outside of the U.S. in China. We right now have about 6,000 stores in China today. We'll have more stores in China in 2025 than we have in the United States. So he's coming back at this time. And my experience, you could have never imagined this, is you're going from a person who created systems, and now you're going back to what I call source code. And you're finding out what all those systems were being based upon, why all those different pieces were situated the way they were situated, and what's the value proposition that we should be delivering every day. One of the first things Howard said to me is never forget that every occasion is a transmission of your culture and of your values. So whether we're in a meeting, whether we're in a function or what have you, that is a transmission of what we are and what we stand for. And then the other piece is this dynamic is, he speaks to this, is our role is to exceed the expectation of our partners. If we exceed the expectation of our partners, they will exceed the expectation of our customers, and then thus we'll be able to see the expectations of our stakeholders. And having that model is very different than what you would consider a publicly traded company model, which tends to be having so many forces around investors or what have you. And then we have Laxman who comes in, and he has he's a global citizen, speaks 6 languages, was Indian by birth, but spent a good amount of his time in the UK. And he's coming to the company with the mindset around not only how do we focus on partner, but how do we focus on things like supply chain in very endemic ways, and bringing what I would call purpose forward as a part of reality. I think this is beyond just ESG measures and much more about how does the purpose actually live inside the company as we move forward. So it's been amazing.
That's great. That's a lot of change, but I'm excited about what's to come.
Yeah.
So just to pivot a bit to our industry,
Yeah.
you and I work together in agencies.
Yes.
You smile when you say that, right? We had a good time. You then went on to Vanda. You were on the Hill with Jim Clyburn. One of the questions I have is, as you think about it, as we've talked about, and I think everyone knows who interacts with me, I believe that communications is arguably the most important tool
Absolutely.
in a toolbox for enterprises and CEOs and like. When you look out, in our industry over the next 12 to 18 months, what do you see as one or two of the most significant challenges that we're going to face as an industry?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would be remiss, and I have to call this out, so I hope you give me a chance for this. So, Chris and I are sitting on stage right now, and I want everybody to appreciate the history that's being made here. Chris is the first African American in the role that he is in, and I'm the first African American in the role that I am in. And I think for our industry, that sends so many signals as to not only what is possible, but how, if you will, the way one builds a career is part and parcel to how one's career gets expressed. And so I just want to say, just acknowledging that. I think 3 things are going to be the challenge for communications going forward. First, communicators now today need to know corporate governance more so than ever before. The framework in which you are operating in, whether you're on a nonprofit, whether you're in the public sector, whether you're in the corporate sector, whether you're an agency, understanding corporate governance is everything, because now so much of what frames what you say, how you say it, and more importantly, how you're orienting the story and the storytelling is around the corporate governance that you're operating within. And I have to say that as we move forward, our power will be around that, because ultimately that is where the conversation of the organization speaks. The second piece is something that we were just talking about, which is the future of diversity. I'm not speaking only around how do we have different people from different backgrounds and experiences and ethnicities or what have you. I'm speaking more about how does diversity become the way in which we redefine what this field is. And I think storytelling, nobody owns the market on that. And so how do we think about bringing those elements across the various platforms that we own? I am mindful that many of the platforms that we have today, TikTok, Twitter, or what have you, all have diverse creators as a part of them. And one has to think about, well, what is the creative diversity wheel in the communication space and public relations there within? The last piece is integrated models. The days of, and Chris knows this well, and I'm sure you all have experienced this, the days of buying one piece of an agency or one element of an agency are over. The days of thinking about your communication structure as individual silos is over. You now have to have these integrated models, because there is no such thing as internal comms without external comms. There's no such thing as social versus non-social. It is all, if you will, integrated and overlayered. And so us being able to have that understanding is going to be critical as we move forward, and having it in a global context.
Right.
I mean, look, I think today, one's inability to navigate the global landscape will literally be the life or death of your company.
And we've lived that.
Yes.
We've lived that. Here's an interesting question, just to stay on this, because one of the things, you've been on agency side, you've been in-house now in your second role on the Hill, nonprofit with Kellogg. Yeah. What are you looking for? 1 or 2 things in an agency partnership. What are you actually looking for?
So first is business acuity. Right?
I hope we delivered it.
Absolutely. I'm grateful for that. But Chris knows that. So I'll give you an example, and this may kind of give a sense of how I'm wired. So when I had a chance of working with one of the greats with Chris, one of the things I appreciated is he gave me the freedom to run as an executive in the company. And I remember distinctly sitting with him and saying, look, Chris, I think the best way for us to be able to think about our value proposition is to look across all of the 8K, 10K, and also proxy filings of companies that we believe we are best situated for, understand their risk variance, and then align that risk variance against what we can deliver as an organization. And that's a much more efficient, targeted, and much more expertise-driven way of actually going about business development. Now, most people, right, if they heard that, they'd be like, oh, no, that doesn't make sense. Let's go and do the RFP and what have you and that kind of things. But I think the ability to grow a business, we were able to do that within a short period of time. We doubled the business within 6 months, is because of that orientation. So the ability to have business acumen is huge. I mean, I'm often shocked when I'm interviewing agencies, not Omnicom, but others. And I asked them, did they listen to our last quarterly earnings? And many of them don't. Or if they read our proxy filing or what have you. I mean, there's so much that's publicly available, if you will, in reference to it, that I'm still shocked to this day that people are only just looking at what I would call the comms content, not understanding that at the end of the day, I got to be able to sell a cup of coffee. And none of this any other elements work. So that's one. The second piece is really making sure that we have a diverse team against us. I mean, I can't speak enough about this. If I am the one bringing diversity walking into the room, that is a problem. Because the reality is I have a board chair. For those of you who may not know, my board chair is Melanie Hobson, who's co-CEO of Ariel Investments. Her husband, by the way, is George Lucas, for all you Star Wars fans. So let me be clear. The way in which our board orientation works is with an understanding of diversity at the helm of it. And that gives both an authorizing environment and also a license to expect that. So one of the things that we have to do, and you can pull this as an executive, a large percent of our compensation is tied to our ability to deliver against our diversity goals. In that, we are also published every year as part of our annual report, our progress as individual executives on our diversity goals. So if we're failing on those things, not only do your colleagues know about it, but the world knows about it. And so I think that accountability orientation is so critical to that. So those would be the two things.
So we're in Washington, right?
Yeah.
A town we both know well. And for those who are visiting, you may not appreciate this, but coming up on a midterm or a general election is like the anticipation of the Super Bowl, right? We have viewing, election viewing parties and all the things that go along with that, and it's dominating the news. AJ had the pleasure, was it a decade?
Yes.
With Congressman Clyburn's office, authored probably and co-authored over 200 pieces of legislation. As you look out at the polarizing environment in which we're living now, which I think is probably the most I've seen, certainly on my time on the planet, two things. What advice do you have for the House Democrat leadership as you move to the fall? and prediction, what would you do differently as we're campaigning in the next 3 weeks?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. So one, Chris rightfully said it, I had the great pleasure of being the first African-American policy director for Majority Whip, Mr. Clyburn. And unlike House of Cards, the whip office, there's no buried bodies anywhere. I didn't take anybody out. I did from time to time run over people, and so those kind of things. But that's
the job of the whip.
Yeah, that's the job of the whip. At the end of the day, I have to deliver the votes. And so, but here's what I would say. So in terms of where I focus. I'm going to give these as some freebies here. So I focus on what I call major macros. So consider this. Currently right now, the senators who are currently running for their reelection and those who will be running in 2024 will have a majority of new voters in their states that they didn't have the last time they ran. Major macros. So the dynamic becomes is the people who they will be facing to get votes, they'll have to reintroduce themselves too. Now, to a certain degree, some people will know them, but they'll have to kind of reinvent. What's interesting is you see a lot of the ad buying that's going on right now. A lot of the ad buying on both sides is introducing people to their people, even if they've been there for some time. So major macros. The same could be said, if you will, for the House. What's been interesting is if you look at the last 6 elections, 20% or more of each House seat has changed in terms of the voting population. And so that in of itself shifts, if you will, the way in which the dynamics are played in. When I was on Capitol Hill, so many of the way you got to Capitol Hill was through the leadership helping you, supporting you, advising you, giving you all the tools and supports and elements necessary to be able to run. Today, that's not the case. People can become a member of Congress and not even have any affiliation with the leadership whatsoever, and quite frankly, can run against leadership and actually win. There's a number of people who've done that. And so that has shifted the way in which the relationship works. So part of my counsel, if there was any counsel to leadership, would to be spend less time actually relationship building with the actual members and spend much more time relationship building with the institutions in their districts.
Fair.
Because in many respects, those are going to be the leverage tools that are going to help you in terms of being able to marshal anywhere, any sense of cohesion or cohesiveness in the structure. And I think in terms of how things will play out, I mean, wow. Let me say this: I am glad. So my swan song on Capitol Hill was I had the financial collapse. And so I was one of the few people who knew derivatives. And so I was a part of what they call the Nifty 19, the 19 staffers who negotiated the financial bailout. And I thought, yep, nothing's going to top that. And those kind of things. And having seen the challenges that the country has faced and is continuing to face, the complexities, and then more importantly, the dynamics around the polarization, one of my hopes, and I would say that we're as a company at Starbucks, we try to push for this, is how can we find the common interests around this, right? And, we recognize that within fear and polarization and whatnot, that there's a whole industry based on that, but there's a bigger industry based on common interests, and how can we lift that industry up in many respects? And I think that's the business that we try to put ourselves in.
No, and I think you do that. So look, we have 2 minutes and 2 seconds.
Let's do it.
And I feel like maybe we could sneak in 2 questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
From the audience. So the light's in my eyes, so I can't. I think there's a question in the back left and then in the center.
Thank you. Stephen from Cavic. Quick question, certainly ahead of the midterms. There's a percent of Starbucks drinkers who are Republican. And as you engage in some of the issues that might be branded as Democrat, how do you think about, or are you trying to ensure that Starbucks is not a blue coffee company or a red coffee company, but just a coffee company?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We have a level of intelligence in the company that most politicians would salivate over. We tend to know what the conversation is changing in the members of Congress districts before they do, because it happens inside our stores. The way that we think about where we position ourselves is based upon our partners. Our partners are our central node in reference to this. And so as we think about whether we are going to position ourselves around healthcare access for women and in terms of reproductive health services, or we think about fertility services, where we think about the position that we're going to take on DACA, all these other issues, or where we're going to find ourselves on social justice, it is really around our partners. Our partners help us drive that conversation. We've always believed that if we land on the right side of our partners, the business will take care of itself.
I think that's fair. Last question, I'll wrap.
Michael Young, thank you very much for the
No problem.
I heard Melody Hobson say in 2020 that capitalism is a system of measurements and rewards.
Yes.
And she's, very famously put in real teeth behind achieving goals. 2-part question: what are the challenges and opportunities you've seen as a part of that? And also, why do you think other organizations, capitalists, have not done the same thing?
Yeah, I think we come at a conversation around capitalism in what I call virtuous capitalism. We think that there is an equitable share that should be oriented. So we don't do this work. We were doing a lot of our elements around sustainability and what have you. In fact, if you go back to our first shareholder letter in 1992, we talked about sustainability back then. And this is before ESGs, before all these other elements came through. And the reason why is because it's good business. And the way in which we want to measure it, the way in which we want to mark against it is a value proposition that we believe we deliver. I would say the challenge we have, and I think this is a challenge for the country, is doing good for the planet going to be something that people say that's more of a political aspiration than it is a human aspiration? And I think it's a conversation we are not having today. In many respects, it's evolving around, well, that's your politics around that issue versus that's your human-centric belief that we got to take care of the planet and be stewards of the planet. And so I think that is there. And I think for Melody, she is very clear about numbers matter. If you know, she has this great statement. I'll say this real quick about diversity. She said, oftentimes she would ask leaders, tell me about how things are going with diversity. And they was like, well, we're working on it. And she's like, and every year we're working on it. And she says, you know, diversity is one of these only places where people can keep working on something, fail, and not get fired. And she felt that needs to change. And the best way you do that is you put measures to that. And so when you come to me and you say, hey, I'm working on profitability, if you miss it over a certain time period, you're going to go. And so the same should be applied, if you will, to these issues, whether it's sustainability, whether it's diversity, whether it's the way in which we think about our corporate governance and other elements that fall within.
In that note, AJ Jones II, it is always a pleasure to see you. I enjoy the work we do together. I'm grateful for that opportunity. I'm proud of you. Keep doing what you're doing, because I'm looking for big things for Starbucks, and I appreciate the partnership. And to Provoke and Paul and Arun, thanks for having us. Very grateful, and thanks.
Let's give them a round of applause, too.
Yeah, I know. Let's do it. Thank you all.